Hey guys, welcome to the third 9 weeks. I'm not gonna lie, I'm a little depressed right now because I really thought the third 9 weeks we'd finally get to be able to come back in class and I'd get to meet you all. But as it stands, we're sticking with the Plan B schedule through the third 9 weeks. Man, I had so many fun get to know you games ready. We were gonna play a card game. We were gonna throw a ball around. We were gonna play this awesome cup game. We were gonna TP Mr. McNichols' house. Okay, maybe we weren't going to do that. But you got to admit, it would have been fun to get to know each other that way. And I don't even know if I'll get to use my classroom management tool this year. I miss having students in class. I don't know, have you ever felt like there's a dark void in your life and you just don't know how to fill it? You try video games, and food, and reading the Federalist Papers, and nothing can do it. Cue the intro. In case you couldn't tell by the intro, we're going to be talking about some dark stuff today, so prepare yourself. Have you ever been in a class with a really annoying kid and you just think to yourself, gosh, I wish the teacher could just hit him upside the head with a mallet? No? Just me that thought that? And besides there may be, and I mean maybe, being good moral reasons why teachers can't use things like these to maintain student discipline, there are also some good legal reasons why teachers can't hit students with a mallet. And one of those legal reasons is the Eighth Amendment, which says, excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. All right, so let's break this down piece by piece. Okay, so like I stated in some of my previous videos, if you're ever accused of a crime, you are arrested and put in prison until your trial. Now, you can't get out of prison before your trial unless someone pays your bail. What is a bail, you may ask? I know you've all probably heard it, but a lot of people don't actually really know what it is. Bail is a deposit of property, usually money, that someone pays to the court in exchange for your release. The accused can then be released from prison under the condition that they return for their trial and their court dates. If the accused does indeed return for their trial and their court dates, then the person that paid the bail will get that money back from the court. But if the accused decides to skip the trial and their court dates, then the court gets to keep that money, and then they bring the accused up on charges of trying to skip the court date, and that's not good. They'll come after you. So yeah, bail is kind of like ransom money. Now, bail is obviously perfectly permissible under the Constitution, but it can't be excessive. What does that mean? Well, if you steal a Kit Kat bar from the grocery store, then your bail to be released can't be like $1 million. Now, if you brutally murder someone to steal a Kit Kat from them, then yeah, your bail might be like $1 million. In that sense, the punishment has to fit the crime, and it's often the judge that gets to decide that. Remember, it's their job to interpret the law. So that excessive bail clause in the Eighth Amendment simply refers to not allowing someone to get out of prison unless someone pays an overly outrageous amount. Excessive fines is kind of the same song, second verse. As any of you that's ever gotten a speeding ticket know, a fine is something you pay for violating the law. You don't have to pay a fine for parking illegally, jaywalking, littering. There's tons of things out there where the government issues fines in exchange for not sending you to prison. If you don't pay the fine or you can't afford to pay the fine, then you go to prison. I recall many of you who were struggling on our flag burning CTQ on which route to take with that tried to pick a middle route and say, well, we'll just find people that burn the flag instead of imprisoning them. But as I try to remind you, if people can't afford the fine or they don't want to pay the fine, then it's straight to prison. Remember at the beginning of the year I said behind every law there's a gun? Well, the same is true of fines too. Behind every fine there's also a gun. Don't pay it, the police are going to come and they might have to use violence to drag you to prison. The kings and queens of yore used to love fines because they could get money for the government by issuing fines for the most stupid little things that people would do. And governments still do that to this day.
The city of Dunedin, Florida wants to take this man's home.
Because I was tardy cutting the grass.
Jim Ficken's mom died, so he went to South Carolina to take care of her estate. City officials then started fining Ficken $500 a day because his grass had grown longer than 10 inches. Such fines add up.
This is a letter from the city attorney demanding $24,454.
Now the fine's up to $30,000.
That's asinine.
Ficken's neighbor can't believe he was fined so much.
Just for grass.
Because Ficken doesn't have $30,000, the city says it will foreclose on his home to collect the fine.
So yeah, that means that local city government is going to take his house and sell his house to collect the fine for not cutting his grass. It's a sneaky way for governments to collect lots and lots of money without taxing the entire population directly.
The city attorney of Dunedin in the last year has sought permission to foreclose on 18 properties.
That violates the Eighth Amendment, says the Institute for Justice. It not only protects us from cruel and unusual punishment,
but right next to that in the Eighth Amendment is a protection to be free from excessive fines. Our founders, they recognize that the ability to fine is the ability to cripple. And it's one of the ways, other than incarceration, that government can really oppress.
if governments can, they will. So we should be grateful for the Eighth Amendment. It protects us from excessive fines. And what's more excessive than politicians taking your home because you didn't cut your grass?
Couldn't have said it better myself, Stossel. Gosh, I love your mustache. So that's what excessive fines is. Forcing someone who has violated a law to pay an outrageous amount. If they don't pay the fine, the government often imprisons them and or may take their property away from them. That dude in Florida knew his Eighth Amendment, and so he sought help. And the Institute for Justice actually sued the city, and last year they won their first round of court cases. See, it pays to know this stuff. It could literally save your house someday. Now, that brings us to the final and perhaps most controversial part of the Eighth Amendment, the Cruel and Unusual Punishments Clause. Okay, so when the Founding Fathers put the Cruel and Unusual Punishments Clause into the Eighth Amendment of the Constitution, they were hoping to strip the government's power to use cruel and inhumane tactics to punish people for crimes. They had three stories likely lingering in their head from history that led them to make this clause and put it into the Constitution. The first story involves the origin of why many people believe Friday the 13th is kind of superstitious. Back during the Crusades, there was a group of religious figures who were really good fighters and good bankers too. They were known as the Knights Templar. I mean, these dudes were like the Navy SEALs of their day. They were really popular and they were really rich, and they set up some of the first banks in Europe because people trusted them to keep their money and to keep it safe. But wealth often breeds envy. King Philip IV of France was largely indebted to them. He owed them a ton of money, and he just really wanted to get rid of them. So King Philip IV of France falsely accused them all of heresy or going against the teachings of the church. And that was a big deal back then. Obviously, these accusations of heresy were completely false, but King Philip IV needed to get them to confess to it so that he could turn to the people who the Templars were wildly popular with and say, hey, look, they admitted it, so it's time to chop off their heads. Now, King Philip figured the best way to get them to confess to heresy was to keep torturing them until they wanted the torture to end and would just admit it so that they would be executed. It was on Friday the 13th of October in 1307 that King Philip IV of France had the Templars arrested and the torture began. It was that event that many historians point to and argue that that was really the beginning of Friday the 13th being kind of a superstitious day. The torture they experienced was awful. They had their shoulders dislocated, their feet were burned. It was so bad that they preferred to just confess to things like spitting on the cross, engaging in homosexual acts, renouncing Jesus as Lord, because they preferred death at that point. Sure enough, once Philip got the written confessions in which he also forced them to write that they were not tortured, he had them burnt alive at the stake. So I suppose that's one way to eliminate your debt. The next set of events that kind of drove the founders to include that Cruel and Unusual Punishments Clause happened not too long after this one. It involved a group called the Spanish Inquisition.
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition!
The Spanish Inquisition was set up in Spain to stomp out any type of belief that went against the Catholic Church at the time, or heresy. It would often use torture to try to get people to confess to heresy so that they could eliminate them, or to try to force people to convert from Islam or Judaism to Christianity. In fact, I'll just let Monty Python. It was much more severe than that, but that was the only school-appropriate way I could kind of show you how their interrogations work. But by using such torturous interrogation techniques, the Spanish Inquisition was able to get a lot of false confessions that then turned into executions. The last major example that the founders had in more recent memory involved King Henry VIII, which is actually a story I've already told you all. Now remember, I told you King Henry VIII was a player. He would end up having 6 wives, and he devised that scheme to get rid of his second wife, where he accused her of cheating on him with like 5 dudes, including her brother and an obscure musician. So they were all arrested and taken to the Tower of London, which I mentioned last week is the place where you go if you're going to be tortured and imprisoned for falling out of favor with the king. And they ended up torturing those 5 guys so severely that they all admitted to having an affair with her. And then they used that evidence in court to say, well, look, she's guilty. Then Henry did what he does best. Chopped her head off and then got married again. But hopefully you see a consistent theme with all those stories. And that theme is that the government wanted to get rid of a particular group of people. And so they would torture them so severely that they would give a false confession, and then that would be used as evidence against them to execute them. Now, cruel and unusual punishments weren't always inflicted just for refusing to confess to something. Sometimes they were inflicted on people who actually were guilty of stuff, and it was still pretty barbaric. So the Founding Fathers wanted to move away from that type of stuff. And that's why they included the cruel and unusual punishments clause. This prevents the government from torturing you or doing something really cruel to you in order to punish you for something. And it prevents them from forcing you to do some sort of unusual punishment, like, I don't know, maybe a judge sentences you to run around naked in a grocery store. But who gets to decide what's considered cruel or unusual? I mean, after all, hasn't society kind of progressed in the last 200 years, and what was considered cruel and unusual then may not be the same thing as it is today? Well, the people that get to decide those things are judges and ultimately the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's actually had a bit of a rough time with the 8th Amendment. And one of the first big challenges they got was whether or not the death penalty is considered inflicting a cruel punishment on someone. I mean, you are literally killing them as punishment. Does that violate the 8th Amendment? At first, the Supreme Court said yes, then they decided to change their mind 4 years later and say no. In a Supreme Court case somewhat involving Charles Manson called Furman versus Georgia, the Supreme Court came up with a test they use to determine if something is cruel and unusual. Number 1, it can't be degrading. It cannot be torture or used to humiliate you. Number 2, it can't be arbitrary. That means you can't make it up on the spot or just wing it. It has to be clear that this is the punishment. And it must be totally rejected by society. So in that case, Furman versus Georgia, which, by the way, no relation to Mr. Furman, the Supreme Court ruled that the death penalty was unconstitutional and violated the 8th Amendment. Then 4 years later, in another case involving Georgia, the Supreme Court reversed that decision and overturned it and said, actually, if you want to do the death penalty, it doesn't violate the Constitution. It's fine. Go ahead. And then the Supreme Court had to decide, okay, well, if we're going to allow the death penalty, is it considered cruel and unusual punishment to kill someone under the age of 18? In one of the first cases the Supreme Court got regarding the execution of juveniles, they ruled that anyone under the age of 16 could not be executed via the death penalty. Then in 1993, 2 Missouri teenagers decided to break into this old woman's house, rob her, and then murder her by tying her up and throwing her off of a bridge. The teenagers in question were 17 years old, and in Missouri at the time, they had the death penalty for anyone convicted of murder above the age of 16. The legal team representing the teenager argued that it was cruel and unusual punishment to execute a 17-year-old kid, and that instead he just deserved a life sentence. The Supreme Court agreed and said that the imposition of the death penalty on anyone under the age of 18 violated the cruel and unusual punishments clause of the 8th Amendment. So the Supreme Court went from saying that the death penalty was unconstitutional to, no, wait, it is constitutional, but you just can't kill anyone under the age of 16, to, no, wait, actually, it's 2 years higher. You can't kill anyone under the age of 18. And this is one of the criticisms of judges on the Supreme Court that adhere to loose constructionism or really believe that the Constitution is an ever-evolving document and should keep up with the times. I mean, in all these cases, here the court was trying to decide how far exactly society progressed and where society was at when it came to the death penalty. And that wasn't easy to figure out because even public opinion today is still constantly changing on the death penalty. And that led to a lot of inconsistencies and changes and a big mess with the Supreme Court when it came to the 8th Amendment. But the death penalty hasn't been the only controversial thing when it comes to the cruel and unusual punishments clause.
Senate Intelligence Committee Democrats claimed the agency brutalized terror suspects, misled Congress and the White House.
The report spells out the so-called enhanced interrogation techniques, including keeping detainees awake for up to 180 hours in stress positions, waterboarding, sensory deprivation, cramped confinement, and vertical shackling. The report says additional rough treatment resulted in permanent injuries and likely one death from hypothermia. That detainee was, quote, held partially nude and chained to a concrete floor.
Wait a second, Mr. Lucas. Didn't you just say the Eighth Amendment prohibits our government from torturing people? Yeah. So our government was and still is torturing people? Yep. How can they do that? I mean, can they do that? Gosh, that's a great question. You know, that would make a great... That's right, you got another critical thinking question assignment this week. I know how some of you just love those CTQ assignments, and I can only imagine your reaction when you heard me say that. All right, so to make it a little less stressful, let's do the setup for the CTQ right now. So if you've been zoning out this entire video and you want to do well on the CTQ assignment, make sure you start paying attention now because I'm going to set it all up for you. So after the September 11th attacks, our government really tried to crack down on terrorism. We invaded Afghanistan to try to get some of the terrorists that were responsible for the attacks and to try to stomp out anyone that might be joining Al-Qaeda, which was the terrorist organization responsible. Whenever our government captured potential terrorist suspects, they sent them to a naval base in Guantanamo Bay, which is in Cuba. The United States actually leases that space out from the Cuban government and tries to pay the Cuban government to operate that naval base off of their shores, although the Cuban government just really leaves the checks on the desk. It doesn't really cash them. The Cubans don't want us there. At Guantanamo Bay, sometimes referred to as Gitmo, suspected terrorists are tortured to try to get information out of them that can help our military try to find other terrorists. Some of them have been held in there indefinitely without a trial for like 14 years. Some of them in there are actually really bad dudes and terrorists. There's actually been quite a few that have been completely innocent. So how is it then that the U.S. government can torture these people at Guantanamo Bay? Some in the U.S. government defend their actions by saying, well, there's some legal loopholes that allow us to do that. Now, first, many of them argue that the Eighth Amendment protects against cruel and unusual punishment. It says nothing about torture used to get important information. Unless torture is being used as a punishment, it is constitutional then for the government to use as a means of simply getting information from someone. So to summarize that, they're basically arguing that the Eighth Amendment protects against cruel and unusual punishment, and that the torture of the suspected terrorists in Guantanamo Bay isn't punishment for them doing anything. The torture is to get information from them, not to punish them. Those who defend the torture in Guantanamo Bay also argue that just like there are limits to free speech and privacy in the First and Fourth Amendments to protect the greater good, so too are there limits to the Eighth Amendment to protect national security and the greater good. They argue that torture helps the government obtain much needed information, which helps them track down and eliminate terrorist threats to protect everyone. If there were a ticking time bomb, for example, that was about to go off and kill a lot of people, I mean, wouldn't you want the government to be able to torture someone to get much needed information to save people's lives? So to summarize that, they're arguing that the needs of the many outweigh the rights of the few. They also argue that foreign terror suspects are not U.S. citizens, and the torture at Guantanamo Bay is also not being done on U.S. soil. Therefore, the Eighth Amendment does not apply to them at all because they're not U.S. citizens and it's not being done in the United States. But those arguments aren't convincing for everyone. Some people point to those stories that I shared earlier in the video and said, hey, the intention of the Eighth Amendment was to prevent the government from extracting information from someone via a cruel or unusual punishment. Torture is inherently a cruel punishment for not giving information or doing what is asked. Therefore, torture automatically violates the Eighth Amendment. So to summarize that argument, they're basically saying you can't tell me that torture is not a form of punishment. I mean, if you're being interrogated by someone and you don't give them the information they want when they ask for it, and they then proceed to torture you, that is kind of a punishment for not giving them the information that they want. They're also saying that the founding fathers did not want there to be any torture because they learned the lessons of history from the stories I shared in this video. They thought that torture really was not an effective way to gain valuable information because people will tell you whatever you want to hear just to get the torture to stop. Therefore, torture has no value to it except being punitive. Folks opposing torture at Guantanamo Bay also have some legal tricks up their sleeves. They argued that the U.S. Supreme Court has already ruled that constitutional rights do also apply to non-U.S. citizens, so foreigners. And that was in the case Boumediene versus Bush. I can never pronounce that. They also cite the fact that the Declaration of Independence states that all men are created equal and have certain rights, even people that aren't U.S. citizens. That's right, all men. To deny foreigners the same Eighth Amendment rights we have is to go against one of our nation's founding principles of equality and natural rights. So to put that in simpler terms, they're arguing that all of the amendments in the Bill of Rights, all the rights included in all of those, including the Eighth Amendment's rights, are natural, God-given rights that every human being has regardless of where they are born. And lastly, many opponents of torture at Guantanamo Bay pull up international law. Hopefully from history class, you remember learning about the Geneva Conventions. And the U.S. signed the Geneva Conventions, which ban nations from using torture on anyone. According to the Supremacy Clause in Article 6 of the Constitution, which we talked about a while back, it says, all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. And they argue that because the Geneva Convention was a treaty ratified by the U.S. Senate, the government must follow it, including its ban on torture. You remember from history class that after World War II at the Geneva Convention, a bunch of countries got together and they made set of agreements on how to conduct themselves during wartime. The Geneva Convention itself will be linked as a resource in your CTQ that you can take a look at, but one of the parts of it talks about torture and what countries are allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do. So this argument is essentially saying that since the United States agreed to the Geneva Convention and it was ratified in the Senate and we approved it and everything, we therefore agree to all the parts in the Geneva Convention, including its ban on torture. Therefore, because of Article 6 Supremacy Clause, which says that any treaty the United States makes is the supreme law of the land, the United States has to follow what's in the Geneva Convention. And if they're torturing people, that means they're violating it. So those are just some of the arguments on both sides of this issue. I mean, there's a lot of other things that you could argue when you do this CTQ. I highly encourage you to take a look at that resource page. Look through the different arguments and stuff and see if you can't find anything to help you out there. That's why I give it to you. Part of this being a critical thinking assignment is that you are able to think of some arguments on your own that maybe I didn't mention in the video, whether that be through your own research or just using logic in your brain. So your assignments for this week, pretty simple and straightforward. You've got this ed puzzle followed by one other ed puzzle, which are both due on Wednesday, and then your CTQ is due on Thursday. As always, reach out if you need anything and do your best to try to get off on a good foot for this third 9 weeks and this second semester as a whole. Good luck.